Judge mocks black man in court, but is stunned by his brilliant legal move. The courtroom hummed with hushed conversations as Malcolm Reese stood alone at the defendant's table. His suit, though neat, showed signs of wear. Across from him, Bryce Lambert, the bank's lead attorney, lounged back in his chair with a self-assured smirk. Judge Ethan Crawley chuckled from the bench. "Representing yourself, Mr. Reese?" the judge remarked, tapping his gavel lightly. "This should be interesting." But Malcolm didn't waver. He met the judge's gaze steadily and responded, "I'm not here for entertainment, Your Honor. I'm here to win." Could a man without a law degree truly expose corruption in a public courtroom? 6 months earlier, Malcolm Reese stood on the cracked front porch of his mother's house, the morning sun stretching long shadows across the worn wooden steps. The home, modest but rich in history, had belonged to his family for 3 generations. It was more than just a building, it was his late mother's legacy. But today, in his hands was an eviction notice. Bold red letters stamped across the top read, "Final notice. Property must be vacated within 14 days. His throat tightened as he reread the words. His mother, Ella Reese, had worked tirelessly. 2 jobs, endless sacrifices, to ensure this house was secure. She had died believing it was fully paid off, free and clear. So how was this happening? Heart pounding, he rushed inside, rifling through the file cabinet in the corner of the living room. Mortgage statements, tax receipts, the original deed, everything was in order. But then, he spotted something he'd never seen before. A second mortgage agreement. It bore what looked like his mother's signature, yet something about the handwriting was off. The strokes were shakier, the slant unfamiliar. His first call was to the bank. He sat on hold for nearly half an hour, his knee bouncing with impatience, until a clipped, disinterested voice finally answered. "Foreclosure Department, First Union Bank." Malcolm tightened his grip on the phone. "I'm calling about an eviction notice for Ella Reese's property. There's been a mistake. The mortgage was paid off. I have the deed." A sigh came through the receiver. "Sir, the account is in default due to non-payment on a second mortgage taken out 2 years ago. Foreclosure proceedings are final." Malcolm's brow furrowed. "That's impossible. My mother never took out a second mortgage." "I'm looking at her signed agreement right here, Mr. Reese. Maybe you weren't aware of her financial situation." The insinuation hit like a slap. His jaw clenched. "I want copies of every document related to this loan. You'll need to file a request with our legal department," the woman replied coolly. "But it won't stop the eviction." The line went dead. Still gripping the phone, Malcolm stared at a framed photo of his mother on the mantel. Taken the day she had burned the original mortgage paperwork, celebrating her final payment. His stomach twisted. Someone was lying. Determined, Malcolm drove straight to the bank, where he was met by Darren Clean, the branch manager. A middle-aged white man with a smug expression. Clean barely glanced at Malcolm's paperwork before shaking his head. "People like you need to learn the system's not built for you," Clean said, sliding the documents back across the desk. "If you're in default, you lose the house. End of story." Malcolm leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Look closely at this signature. It's not my mother's." Clean's eyes flicked to the page, but his smirk didn't fade. Signatures change over time. People get desperate, make bad decisions. "Maybe she didn't tell you. She didn't take out this loan," Malcolm shot back. "And you know it." Clean's expression hardened. "If you want to fight it, hire a lawyer. But you better move fast. You've got 2 weeks. Malcolm left the bank seething. He didn't have the luxury of hiring an attorney. After losing his social work job due to corporate downsizing, he'd been scraping by on part-time janitorial work at the local community center. Every paycheck went toward food, utilities, and keeping the lights on. There was no room for legal fees. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him, his eyes burning from hours of scrutinizing fine print. His phone buzzed. A message from his girlfriend, Nara. "How bad is it?" "Bad," he typed back. "But I'm not giving up." The next morning, he visited the local legal aid office. The receptionist barely glanced at his paperwork before shaking her head. "We're at capacity. Try private counsel." One firm after another turned him down. Some cited conflicts of interest, others claimed overwhelming caseloads. The more blunt ones didn't bother with an excuse. "We don't take cases we can't win." Frustration mounting, Malcolm returned home to find a white notice taped to his door. Sheriff's eviction scheduled for 10 days from today. His pulse quickened. He had less than 2 weeks to fight an entire system seemingly designed to break him. That evening, he attended a town hall meeting, hoping to speak with Councilman Brent Holloway, a politician known for his community outreach. When Malcolm finally managed to get his attention after the meeting, Holloway gave him a tight smile. "I sympathize with your situation," he said, patting Malcolm's shoulder in a way that felt more dismissive than reassuring. "But the bank followed procedure. The best thing you can do is find alternative housing." "Alternative housing?" Malcolm snapped. "This isn't just a house. It's my family's history." Holloway's smile faded. "History doesn't pay the bills, son." The word son hung in the air, thick with condescension. Malcolm stepped back, his chest tightening. They had already decided he didn't belong. This eviction wasn't just about money, it was about power, about erasure. He returned home feeling defeated, but not broken. Sitting on the edge of his mother's bed, the weight of generations pressing down on him, one thought crystallized. If they think I'll walk away quietly, they don't know who they're dealing with. The fight had just begun. Malcolm sat at the kitchen table long past midnight, papers scattered across the worn wooden surface. The eviction notice glared back at him like a death sentence. Bold, red, and unforgiving. For the past 6 hours, he had been cross-referencing every document he could find. Yet the second mortgage agreement still didn't add up. The handwriting was too shaky, inconsistent with his mother's usual signature. The notary stamp looked official, but something about the ink seemed off, faded unevenly, as if it had been copied. His laptop hummed softly as he typed. Mortgage fraud cases. Page after page of foreclosure horror stories filled the screen. Families forced from their homes due to paperwork errors, predatory loans, and, more often than not, forged signatures. One case stood out, Martin versus Horizon Bank, where a homeowner had successfully challenged foreclosure after proving the mortgage transfer was invalid. The key discovery? A formal request for all documents related to the loan. Determined, Malcolm jotted down notes, his mind racing. He needed help, but after being turned away by multiple attorneys, he knew this fight would be his alone. He glanced at the clock. 3:12 a.m. sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. The next morning, Malcolm drove downtown to the courthouse, clutching a folder filled with every piece of evidence he had. The building's marble steps gleamed in the early sunlight, but the weight of systemic bias seemed to seep from the very walls. Inside, he waited nearly an hour before finally reaching the clerk's window. "I need to file a motion for a stay of eviction," Malcolm said, sliding the paperwork across the counter. The clerk, a middle-aged white woman with sharp eyes, barely glanced at the forms before shaking her head. "Are you representing yourself?" she asked, her tone thick with skepticism. "Yes," she exhaled slowly. "You'd be better off finding an attorney. These cases don't usually end well for pro-SE defendants." "I don't have time for an attorney," Malcolm replied, his jaw tightening. "Just file the motion." Reluctantly, she stamped the forms and handed him a copy. "The judge will review it," she said, "but don't get your hopes up." By noon, Malcolm was back home, exhaustion pressing down on him. He sat on the porch, flipping through the paperwork when his phone buzzed. "Nara, any luck?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "I filed for a stay." He sighed. "It's a long shot, but it's something." She hesitated. "Malcolm, you can't keep pushing like this. What if you lose? What if they come while you're at work and throw everything out on the street?" "I can't think about that," he muttered. "This isn't just about a house. It's about standing up to people who think they can steamroll us because we don't have money or connections." Nara was quiet for a moment. "Just don't let this fight destroy you." Malcolm didn't answer. He couldn't. because deep down he knew she was right, but surrendering wasn't an option. 2 days later, the court's response arrived. Motion denied. Malcolm stood in the courthouse hallway, the rejection letter trembling in his hands. His heart pounded, dread settling deep in his chest. He had done everything right. Gathered evidence, filed paperwork, followed procedures, and still the system had slammed the door in his face. Fueled by frustration, he stormed into the bank branch where the second mortgage had originated. Darren Clean, the smirking branch manager, sat behind a polished oak desk, sipping coffee like he hadn't just signed away Malcolm's family's legacy. "I need to see the original loan documents for the second mortgage," Malcolm demanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. Clean leaned back lazily, adjusting his tie. "I already told you, Mr. Reese, the foreclosure is final. You're wasting everyone's time. Then prove it. Show me the documents." Clean's smile widened, predatory and cold. "File a discovery request. Otherwise, this conversation is over." Malcolm's fists clenched, but he knew arguing wouldn't get him anywhere. Gritting his teeth, he turned and walked out, humiliation burning in his chest. Outside, the hot sun beat down as he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. That evening, back at the community center where he worked part-time, Malcolm scrubbed the empty halls, his mind churning with frustration. One of the volunteers, Mrs. Holloway, an elderly black woman who had lived through the civil rights movement, watched him quietly. "Baby, you look like the world's sitting on your shoulders," she finally said. Malcolm sighed, leaning against the mop handle. "It kind of feels that way." She nodded, thoughtful. "My daddy always said when they push you to the edge, you got two choices, fall or fight. But if you're gonna fight, you best know their game better than they do." Her words hit Malcolm like a lightning bolt. The law. He didn't need a lawyer if he could become his own expert. The system was built to confuse and intimidate, but laws were written down. He could study them, learn them, use them. That night, Malcolm cleared the kitchen table and spread out every document he had. He had borrowed law books from the library, printed foreclosure guidelines from the state website, and started highlighting, cross-referencing, and taking notes. Sleep became an afterthought. Every free moment was spent buried in paperwork, fueled by coffee and sheer determination. Days blurred together until, finally, he found it. A single line in the foreclosure statute. All mortgage transfers must be accompanied by a valid endorsement from the previous lender. It was a technicality, but a powerful one. Malcolm pulled up the bank's filings and froze. The last transfer of his mother's mortgage lacked the required endorsement. Legally, the bank had no right to foreclose. Heart pounding, he filed a new motion, this time requesting full discovery of all documents related to the mortgage. He knew it was a gamble. The judge could dismiss it outright. But if it was approved, the bank would have to reveal everything. 2 days later, the court responded, "Motion for discovery. Granted." Malcolm sat on the couch, the paper trembling in his hands. He had done it. He had forced the system to acknowledge his fight. But as relief washed over him, another realization hit. The bank wouldn't go down quietly. They would retaliate, and they did. The very next morning, his bank account was frozen due to a so-called fraud investigation. His utility bills, set to autopay, bounced. By evening, the electricity was shut off. When he called the bank, they claimed it was a technical issue. But the smugness in Darren Klein's voice told him the truth. Later that night, Nia showed up, her face tight with worry. "Your car's gone." Malcolm's stomach dropped. He rushed outside. His old sedan, which had been parked at the curb, was missing. Repossession. A neighbor called out from across the street. "Tow truck came by an hour ago." Looked official. Malcolm's chest tightened. It wasn't just about the house anymore. They were trying to break him, trying to make him quit. He stood there, fists clenched at his sides, heart pounding in his ears. They had underestimated him. He wasn't just fighting for his home now. He was fighting for every person who had ever been crushed by a system designed to keep them powerless. Was Malcolm pushing too far, risking everything for a battle he couldn't win? Or was this the moment that would define his future? Comment below if you believe Malcolm is right to keep fighting, even when the odds are stacked against him. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story if you stand for justice. But here's the real question. If the system itself is corrupt, how far will Malcolm have to go to expose the truth? And will he survive the battle? Stay tuned for the next part. Malcolm sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the hum of the fridge the only sound breaking the silence. His utilities were still off. His bank account was frozen. His car was gone. The system was retaliating, trying to choke him out. But the court's approval of his discovery request was more than just a lifeline. It was a weapon, and he just had to wield it correctly. The next morning, Malcolm walked into the courthouse, his steps purposeful despite the exhaustion pulling at his limbs. He handed the clerk his official request for discovery, detailing every document he needed from the bank, the original mortgage agreement, all transfer records, and the notarized second mortgage papers they claimed his mother had signed. The clerk, a younger black woman named Tasha, glanced at the papers and gave him a tired but knowing smile. "Fighting the bank?" she asked quietly. "Every damn day," Malcolm muttered. "Well," she said, stamping the request, "most people give up by now. Good luck." Luck had nothing to do with it, Malcolm thought. This was survival. 3 days later, the bank responded. Not with the requested documents, but with a motion to dismiss the discovery request entirely, claiming it was overly broad and burdensome. Malcolm read the filing twice, fury building with every word. They weren't even pretending to follow the rules. Without hesitation, he drafted a countermotion, citing specific case law he had found during his late-night research. He hand-delivered it to the courthouse, earning another nod from Tasha as she accepted the paperwork. That same afternoon, he received a call. Judge Crawley's chambers. The judge wanted an in-person hearing to address the excessive nature of Malcolm's discovery request. Malcolm knew exactly what that meant. The judge was giving the bank another chance to crush him, in open court. 2 days later, Malcolm stood before the bench, facing off against Bryce Lambert, the bank's lead attorney. Lambert was exactly what Malcolm expected. Slicked back hair, a tailored suit, and a condescending smirk barely hiding his contempt. "Your Honor," Lambert began smoothly, "this request is nothing more than a fishing expedition. Mr. Reese is grasping at straws, trying to delay an inevitable foreclosure." Judge Crawley, lounging back in his chair, nodded lazily. "Mr. Reese," he drawled, "why should I make the bank jump through hoops for you?" Malcolm stepped forward, holding up 2 copies of the mortgage agreement, the original and the one tied to the second mortgage. "Because, Your Honor," Malcolm said firmly, "the bank filed 2 versions of the same document. Look at the signatures, they don't match." Crawley barely glanced at the papers, clearly uninterested. "Signatures change over time," he said dismissively. "Not in 3 months," Malcolm shot back. "And not when the second signature was supposedly signed the day after my mother was hospitalized for a stroke." That got Crawley's attention. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're saying the bank falsified documents?" "I'm saying," Malcolm replied, his voice steady, "without full discovery, we'll never know. If they have nothing to hide, they shouldn't have any issue providing the original documents." Lambert's smile wavered. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The foreclosure was carried out according to standard procedure." Crawley sighed, rubbing his temple. He hated being put in a position where he had to appear impartial. "Fine," he muttered. "Discovery request stands. The bank has 7 days to provide the documents." Malcolm's heart raced as Crawley banged his gavel. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a step forward. Lambert shot him a cold look, already planning his next move. Outside the courtroom, Malcolm barely made it to the courthouse steps when his phone buzzed. It was Nia. "Did you win?" she asked anxiously. "Not a win," Malcolm answered, staring at the courthouse doors. "But they have to hand over the documents." There was a pause. "And if they don't?" she asked softly. Malcolm replied quietly, "We'll know the fraud goes deeper than I thought." But Malcolm didn't even have to wait the full 7 days. 3 days later, After returning home from his night shift at the community center, he found two movers hauling his mother's old couch out the front door. "What the hell are you doing?" Malcolm shouted, rushing up the cracked concrete steps. The sheriff's deputy, a burly white man wearing mirrored sunglasses, barely glanced at him. "Eviction order. Effective immediately." "Eviction?" Malcolm's stomach sank. "The court granted a stay." "Not anymore," the deputy drawled, holding up a new order signed by Judge Crawley. "The bank filed new evidence this morning. Foreclosure's final." Malcolm snatched the paper, his hands shaking. The new evidence was a revised version of the mortgage transfer, complete with a notarized signature. Undoubtedly a forgery, but polished enough to fool anyone not looking closely. He turned toward the movers. "Stop that. That couch belonged to my grandmother. Not your house anymore, buddy." One of the movers muttered, dropping the couch unceremoniously on the lawn. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, some watching with pity, others with barely concealed satisfaction. One man across the street chuckled, arms crossed. "Should have known better than to think you'd keep a place like this." Malcolm stood frozen as the movers stripped the house bare. His family's history, their memories, reduced to furniture on a curb. By nightfall, Malcolm sat on the front steps, defeated. The street lamp cast long shadows across the empty lawn. His phone buzzed again. It was Nia. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "Home," Malcolm muttered bitterly. "Or what's left of it." "Come stay with me," she pleaded. "You can't sleep outside." But Malcolm couldn't move. He stared at the empty doorway. The house was dark and lifeless. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was war. They had rigged the system, forged documents, weaponized the courts, and gotten away with it. Until now. Malcolm stood slowly, determination hardening his features. If they want a fight, they'll get one. He wasn't just fighting for a house anymore. He was fighting for justice, for his mother's legacy, for everyone the system had crushed and discarded. Because if they could do this to him, they could do it to anyone. And Malcolm Reese wasn't about to let that happen. Malcolm sat on the curb outside his mother's empty house, the cold seeping through his worn jacket as night fell over the neighborhood. His belongings, what little hadn't been broken or stolen, were scattered across the lawn, a stark reminder of how quickly everything could be taken. The eviction crew had been efficient, almost mechanical, tossing decades of memories onto the street like garbage. His phone buzzed again. It was Nia. He let it ring. What could he say? That everything they'd worked for was gone? That the system had crushed him just like it had crushed so many others? Instead, he stood slowly, determination stiffening his spine. They wanted him broken, silent, erased. But Malcolm Reese wasn't done fighting. The next morning, he walked into the courthouse, head held high despite the exhaustion weighing on his limbs. He filed an emergency motion to contest the eviction, armed with copies of the forged documents the bank had used to push it through. When he handed the papers to the clerk, she gave him a tired, almost pitying look. "You're back again?" she sighed, stamping the motion. "Mr. Reese, I don't mean to sound cruel, but do you really think you can win this?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I don't think," he said quietly. "I know." But the system wasn't finished punishing him yet. That afternoon, as he left the courthouse, a patrol car eased up alongside him. The officer inside, a pale man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses, leaned out the window. "Mr. Reese," the cop drawled. Malcolm stopped, heart racing. "Yeah, got a report about someone matching your description loitering around private property," the officer said, gesturing toward the courthouse. "Mind explaining why you're hanging around here?" Malcolm's fists clenched. "I'm filing legal documents," he shot back. "That's what courthouses are for." The officer smirked. Sure. Just making sure you're not causing trouble. You know how it is." Malcolm didn't respond. He knew exactly how it was. Later that evening, he found himself sitting in the community center's break room, sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the peeling walls. "Miss Holloway," The elderly volunteer who had once told him to know their game shuffled in, her face creased with concern. "Baby, you look like you've been fighting the whole world," she said, settling into the chair across from him. Malcolm managed a tired smile. "Feels that way." "Well," she said, her voice firm despite her age, "don't let them beat you down. You've got more fight in you than they ever counted on." Her words stayed with him as he left the center. Walking back to the small motel room, he'd scraped together enough money to rent. But even that fragile sense of safety didn't last long. 2 days later, while Malcolm was reviewing his court filings at a diner, his phone buzzed with an alert. "Your bank account has been frozen due to suspicious activity." His stomach dropped. Without access to his funds, he couldn't pay for the motel, food, or even transportation. It wasn't a coincidence, the bank was tightening the noose. Desperate, he called the bank's fraud department, only to be greeted by the same smug voice he had come to despise. "Darren Clean." Mr. Reese, Clean drawled, sounding almost entertained. "Looks like there's been some unusual activity on your account. Standard procedure to freeze it while we investigate." "What unusual activity?" Malcolm demanded, gripping the phone tighter. Clean chuckled. "Hard to say. Might be all those legal filings. Funny how paperwork tends to stir up trouble." Malcolm's hand trembled as he ended the call. This wasn't just about a house anymore. They were trying to ruin his life, piece by piece, until he had no choice but to give up. That evening, things took a turn for the worse. As Malcolm stepped out of the motel lobby, 2 sheriff's deputies approached, hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Malcolm Reese?" one asked, ice cold. "Yeah," Malcolm replied cautiously. "We need you to come with us," the deputy said. "You've been reported for trespassing at a private residence." Malcolm blinked. "Trespassing? Where?" The deputy smirked. "Your old house. A neighbor said you were snooping around." "I haven't been near that house since they threw me out," Malcolm snapped, frustration boiling over. "Tell it to the judge," the other deputy muttered, snapping handcuffs around Malcolm's wrists before he could protest further. Hours later, Malcolm sat in a holding cell, the sour stench of old sweat and disinfectant stinging his nose. He hadn't been officially charged, just detained for questioning. The message was clear: back off or face real consequences. When they finally released him, just before dawn, his phone was dead, his wallet nearly empty, and the motel had already locked him out for non-payment. Homeless, broke, and exhausted, Malcolm sat on a bench outside the station, head in his hands. But the fire inside him hadn't died. If anything, it burned hotter. They'd frozen his funds, taken his home, and thrown him in a cell without cause. But they hadn't taken his mind or his resolve. By sunrise, Malcolm was back at the library, poring over foreclosure law once again. And that's when he found it, a crack in the bank's armor. The transfer of his mother's mortgage had changed hands 3 times, but the final transfer lacked a crucial endorsement. Without it, the bank had no legal grounds to foreclose. It was a small technicality, buried deep in legal jargon that most people would overlook, but Malcolm saw it for what it was, a lifeline. He filed another motion, this time challenging the bank's standing to foreclose based on the missing endorsement. The next day, as Malcolm exited the courthouse, Bryce Lambert was waiting for him on the steps, arms crossed, a smug grin playing on his lips. "Mr. Reese," Lambert drawled, "I admire your persistence. Really, I do. But you're wasting your time. We've already filed a motion to dismiss your latest nonsense." Malcolm didn't flinch. "Funny," he said. "Anything about the law, Mr. Lambert? It doesn't care how many fancy suits you own. If you don't have standing, you don't have a case." Lambert's smile flickered for just a moment. Malcolm saw it, the first real sign that his fight was working. But the bank wasn't finished retaliating. That evening, Malcolm returned to the community center to find the director, a middle-aged white man named Tom Brooks, waiting for him by the door, arms crossed. "Malcolm," Brooks said, his expression tight, "I hate to do this, but I have to let you go." Malcolm blinked, stunned. "What? Why?" Brooks sighed, avoiding eye contact. We've had complaints. People are saying you're bringing unwanted attention to the center. Donors are getting nervous. I can't afford to lose funding over this." Malcolm's breath caught. They weren't just coming after him. They were cutting off every avenue of survival: his job, his money, his home. They were trying to erase him completely. By the time Malcolm stumbled back to the motel, now forced to sneak in through the side door since he couldn't pay for another night, he was running on fumes. He collapsed onto the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how much longer he could hold out. Was this fight even winnable? Or was Malcolm pushing against a system too powerful to break? Comment number 1. If you think Malcolm should keep fighting, no matter the cost, like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe the system needs to be held accountable. But here's the real question. When the system itself becomes the enemy, how far can one man go before it breaks him or he breaks it? Stay tuned for the next part. Malcolm sat on the edge of the motel bed, phone in hand, staring blankly at the dark screen. His bank account was frozen, his job gone, and he was officially homeless. The system hadn't just beaten him down. It had stripped him bare, piece by piece, until survival itself felt like a daily rebellion. He hadn't eaten since the stale gas station sandwich the night before, and the rumbling hunger in his stomach was nothing compared to the burning frustration in his chest. He knew this fight wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It was about power, who had it, who didn't, and how the system was rigged to make sure people like him stayed powerless. But Malcolm still had one thing they couldn't freeze, steal, or evict: his mind. He spent the morning at the public library, poring over case law, foreclosure statutes, and civil rights litigation. He jotted down notes furiously, his pen scratching across the yellow legal pad until his hand cramped. He didn't notice the woman watching him from across the room until she approached, dropping a thick folder onto the table with a soft thud. "You're fighting First Union, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Malcolm blinked, caught off guard. The woman looked to be in her late 20s, Latina, with sharp eyes that hinted at long hours spent under fluorescent lights. Her ID badge was clipped to her cardigan. "Who's asking?" Malcolm replied cautiously. "Someone who hates seeing people get steamrolled," she said, pulling out a chair. "Linda Orty. I used to work in their legal department. I saw too many families lose their homes because they didn't know how to fight back. I couldn't live with it, so I left. But not before I made copies of certain things." She slid the folder toward him. Malcolm hesitated, then flipped it open. Inside were internal memos, emails, and scan documents, some stamped confidential, detailing how the bank had fast-tracked foreclosures in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. One memo stood out: priority processing for high-risk properties. Minimize litigation exposure by expediting evictions before challenges can be filed. "High risk," Malcolm muttered, brow furrowing. "That's corporate speak for Black-owned," Linda said bitterly. "They targeted neighborhoods like yours because they assumed people wouldn't have the resources to fight back." Malcolm's throat tightened. He had suspected racism played a role, but seeing it spelled out so blatantly made his blood boil. "Why are you giving me this?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "If the bank finds out." "They won't," Linda cut in. "I already lost my job over this. But if you can use it to stop them from stealing your house, it's worth it." Malcolm nodded slowly. He didn't trust easily anymore, but the anger in Linda's eyes was real. She wasn't offering charity. She was giving him a weapon. "Thank you," Malcolm said quietly, gripping the folder like a lifeline. "This changes everything." But the victory was short-lived. 2 days later, Malcolm returned to the library after yet another fruitless trip to the courthouse, only to find Linda waiting for him on the front steps. Her face was pale, her expression tense. "They fired me," she said, voice shaking. "Someone tipped them off. They said I violated company policy by accessing restricted documents." Malcolm's stomach dropped. "Did they mention me?" Linda nodded grimly. "Not by name, but they made it clear they know someone's challenging the foreclosure, and they're closing ranks fast." Before Malcolm could respond, Linda's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and cursed under her breath. "My bank account's frozen," she muttered. just like yours was." The words hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. The bank wasn't just defending itself anymore. It was retaliating. Hard. Fast. And against anyone who dared to stand in their way. "You need to lay low," Malcolm urged. "They're not just after me anymore. They'll come for you too." Linda hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "Be careful, Malcolm. They play dirty." That night, Malcolm sat in the corner of a 24-hour diner, nursing a cup of burnt coffee. His phone vibrated. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Reese." A smooth male voice spoke, practiced politeness masking quiet authority. "This is Bryce Lambert, counsel for First Union Bank. I'd like to offer you an opportunity to settle this matter quietly." Malcolm's jaw clenched. "Quietly? You mean give up my mother's house and pretend none of this ever happened?" "Precisely," Lambert replied, his tone almost cheerful. "In exchange, we'll unfreeze your accounts, clear your credit, and provide a modest relocation stipend. You can start fresh, Mr. Reese. Walk away while you still can." Malcolm gripped the phone tighter. "And if I don't?" Lambert's politeness vanished. "Then we'll bury you," he said coolly. "Your case will get tied up in procedural motions until you can't afford to fight anymore. You'll lose the house, your job prospects, everything. And when you finally crawl away, broke and broken, you'll realize you should have taken the deal." The line went dead. Malcolm sat there, heart pounding, rage simmering beneath the surface. They weren't even pretending to follow the law anymore. They were playing the game the only way they knew how, with intimidation and brute force. The next morning, Malcolm walked into the courthouse to file another motion. This time, he demanded a full audit of the mortgage transfers under the state's anti-predatory lending statute. It was a long shot, but it was the only card he had left to play. As he stepped out of the courthouse, his phone buzzed again. "Nia, you need to stop," she said, her voice tight with fear. "I saw 2 men outside my apartment last night, watching the door. I called the cops, but they just shrugged it off. This fight, it's not just about you anymore, Malcolm. It's spreading." Malcolm's breath caught. He had expected retaliation, but not like this. Not targeting the people he cared about. "Nia," he said quietly, "I can't stop. If they win, it's not just my house. It's every house they've stolen. Every family they've crushed because they thought no one would fight back." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Nia sighed. "Then fight smart," she said, "because they're playing for keeps." That night, Malcolm sat alone in the motel room. The flickering glow of a neon sign outside cast restless shadows on the wall. He had gained an ally, lost her, and now the bank was tightening its grip. Not just on him, but on anyone connected to his fight. He flipped through Linda's folder once more, scanning the damning memos, the forged signatures. The evidence was strong, but evidence alone wouldn't win this battle. He needed something more. Something they couldn't bury with legal tricks or corporate muscle. And then it hit him. The notary. The signature on the second mortgage had been notarized. But if the notary hadn't actually witnessed the signing, the entire document was invalid. Fraud, perjury, a criminal offense. Heart pounding, Malcolm grabbed his phone and began searching state notary databases. After an hour of digging, he found her, Denise Fowler, a licensed notary, last known address 2 towns over. If he could track her down, and if she was willing to talk, he might finally have the leverage he needed to shift the balance in his favor. But in the back of his mind, one unsettling thought lingered. How far would the bank go to protect its power? Malcolm had already lost his home, his job, and nearly everything else. What was left for them to take? He'd find out soon enough. Because Malcolm wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, Malcolm sat on the edge of his motel bed. The flickering neon glow from the vacancy sign outside cast restless shadows across the room. In his lap lay Linda's folder, filled with damning evidence of the bank's corruption. But evidence alone wasn't enough. He needed a witness, someone who could confirm the forgery. And Denise Fowler, the notary listed on the second mortgage, was his best shot. Malcolm drove 2 towns over in a borrowed car, every passing mile winding his nerves tighter. He found Denise's house, a modest, single-story home with peeling white paint and a sun-faded "Beware of Dog" sign hanging on the gate. He knocked twice, his heartbeat loud in his ears. After a moment, the door cracked open. A middle-aged black woman with weary eyes peered out. "Ms. Fowler," Malcolm asked, holding up a copy of the notarized document. "I need to talk to you about this signature." Her gaze flicked to the paper, and her face paled. "I can't help you," she muttered, starting to close the door. "Please," Malcolm pressed, wedging his foot in the doorway. "This isn't just about me. They're stealing homes. Families are losing everything because of signatures like this." Denise hesitated, guilt flickering across her face. Finally, she exhaled heavily and stepped aside. Inside, the house was neat but sparse, the air thick with the scent of burnt coffee. She gestured toward the couch, but Malcolm remained standing. "I didn't witness that signature," Denise admitted quietly, avoiding his gaze. "A banker brought me the papers, said the client was sick and couldn't come in, told me it was just a formality. I stamped it without thinking." "Do you realize what that means?" Malcolm asked, his voice tight. "They used your notary seal to forge a loan. That's fraud. Perjury. It makes the foreclosure completely invalid." "I know," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "But if I testify, they'll come after me. My job, my house, everything." Malcolm swallowed hard. He couldn't guarantee her safety, but he could promise the truth. "If we don't fight this, they'll keep doing it. To more families, to more people like us." Denise wiped at her eyes, then nodded slowly. "I'll testify." With Denise's statement in hand, Malcolm returned to the courthouse. He filed an emergency motion to reopen the case based on newly discovered fraud. Judge Crawley, clearly irritated by Malcolm's persistence, set a hearing for the following week. It wasn't immediate relief, but it was progress. But the bank wasn't done playing dirty. 2 days later, Malcolm woke to find his motel door ajar. The lock had been busted. Inside, the room was ransacked. Papers scattered, drawers overturned, his laptop missing. His heart pounded as he sifted through the mess. The folder with Linda's documents was gone. Panic surged through him. He grabbed his phone and dialed Linda, straight to voicemail. He tried Denise next. "Ms. Fowler, are you okay?" he asked the moment she picked up. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled. "But 2 men came by my job, asking questions. They knew I talked to you." Malcolm cursed under his breath. The bank was tightening the noose, but instead of scaring him off, it only fueled his determination. The next few days were a blur. He barely slept, running on gas station coffee and adrenaline. He pored over foreclosure statutes, memorized case law, and printed duplicate copies of every stolen document. He wasn't just fighting for his house anymore. He was fighting to expose the entire corrupt system. The day of the hearing arrived. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as Malcolm stepped inside. At the plaintiff's table, Bryce Lambert sat, his usual smugness replaced by something colder, more calculating. Judge Crawley barely glanced at Malcolm as he took his seat. "Mr. Reese," Crawley drawled, flipping through the case file. "Back again, I see." "Yes, Your Honor," Malcolm replied, voice steady. "And this time, I have proof of fraud." Lambert shot to his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. These claims are baseless and meant to delay lawful foreclosure." "Baseless," Malcolm snapped, holding up the notary affidavit signed by Denise Fowler. "This document proves the bank submitted a forged mortgage agreement. The notary herself confirmed she never witnessed the signature. That makes the foreclosure not just illegal, but criminal." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Crawley's brows furrowed as he leaned forward, suddenly paying attention. "Mr. Lambert?" the judge said slowly, his tone sharp. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Lambert's jaw tightened. "Your Honor," he said stiffly, "we were unaware of any irregularities. We'll need time to verify these claims." Malcolm stepped forward. "Time?" he repeated. "The bank has already evicted me. They've frozen my accounts, destroyed my credit, and harassed witnesses. How much more time do they need to cover their tracks? Judge Crawley let out a heavy sigh, clearly annoyed, but unable to ignore the evidence. Fine, he said at last. The court will grant a temporary. It wasn't a final victory, but it was the first real crack in the bank's armor. Outside the courthouse, Denise approached Malcolm, visibly shaken. They're not going to let this go, are they? No, Malcolm admitted. But neither are we. That night, back at the motel, Malcolm received an anonymous text. You should have taken the settlement. This isn't over. He stared at the screen, anger bubbling beneath his exhaustion. The bank was wounded, but a wounded predator was even more dangerous. They would retaliate harder and faster than before. Would Malcolm's determination be enough to withstand the next wave of attacks? Or was he pushing too far, risking everything for a fight he couldn't win? Comment number 1. If you believe Malcolm should keep fighting no matter the cost, like, subscribe, and share if you stand for justice. But here's the real question. With the bank backed into a corner and the stakes higher than ever, what ruthless move will they make next? And will Malcolm survive it? Stay tuned for the next part. Malcolm barely slept the night after the hearing. The temporary stay of foreclosure was a small win, but he knew the bank wouldn't take it quietly. He kept his phone close, expecting the next blow to land. When it came, it wasn't subtle. 2 days later, Malcolm walked into the courthouse to check the status of his discovery request. The clerk, a middle-aged white woman with weary eyes, glanced at her computer screen and frowned. Your case has been flagged for procedural review, she said, typing rapidly. It's been removed from the active docket pending further evaluation. Malcolm's stomach dropped. What does that mean? The judge just granted the stay. The clerk shrugged. It means someone filed an emergency motion for reconsideration. Until the judge reviews it, the stay is effectively paused. Malcolm stepped away from the counter, blood pounding in his ears. Reconsideration, a legal loophole, a stalling tactic used to bury cases until the other side ran out of money or time. And Malcolm was running out of both. His phone buzzed as he stepped outside. It was Denise Fowler. They froze my accounts, she said, panic lacing her voice. I can't access my paycheck, and my landlord is already threatening eviction. Malcolm swore under his breath. Stay calm. They're trying to intimidate us. Well, it's working, Denise snapped. I'm losing everything because I helped you. Before Malcolm could respond, another call flashed across his screen. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Mr. Reese, came Bryce Lambert's smooth, condescending voice. It seems you've stirred up quite the mess. I warned you this would happen. Malcolm's grip tightened around the phone. You're freezing accounts now? Harassing witnesses? That's witness tampering, Lambert. Lambert chuckled. Big words for a man sleeping in a motel. This isn't about law anymore, Mr. Reese. It's about survival. Walk away, and maybe we'll stop squeezing. Malcolm hung up, rage boiling in his chest. The bank wasn't just fighting his case, they were trying to crush him, piece by piece. By the time he returned to the motel, the front desk clerk was waiting. Arms crossed, he eyed Malcolm coldly. Mr. Reese, your card was declined. You're behind 2 nights. I need payment by tomorrow morning, or you're out. Malcolm didn't argue. What was the point? His account was frozen. His savings gone. He gathered his few belongings and spent the night in his car, parked in a dimly lit corner of a community center lot. The irony wasn't lost on him. Fighting for a home while sleeping in the back seat of a borrowed car. The next morning, hunger gnawed at his stomach as he walked to the library. He bought a coffee with the last crumpled dollar in his pocket, then settled into a corner table, flipping through the legal notes he'd painstakingly compiled. His phone buzzed again. A text from Linda Ortiz. Call me. Found something. Malcolm dialed immediately. Linda answered on the first ring, her voice hushed. I got into the bank's internal system one last time before they revoked my access, she whispered. There's an email chain, Lambert and Klein discussing how they accelerated your eviction by submitting revised documents without proper filing. They knew the judge wouldn't look too closely. Malcolm's breath caught. Do you have the emails? I saved screenshots, Linda said. But if I share them, I'm done. Blacklisted from every firm in the state. I get it, Malcolm said quietly. But this isn't just about me anymore. Linda let out a heavy sigh. I'll send them, but be careful. They're playing for keeps. Minutes later, the screenshots arrived. Emails between Lambert, Klein, and even Judge Crawley's assistant, detailing how they bypassed standard procedures to rush Malcolm's foreclosure. Blatant corruption, the kind of evidence that could blow the case wide open. But before Malcolm could file the new documents, the bank struck again. That afternoon, while Malcolm was printing copies of the emails at a FedEx store, his phone rang. Nia. Malcolm, she said, her voice shaking. 2 guys in suits came to my job. They asked my manager if I was involved in illegal activities. Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone. My boss said if I bring any more heat, I'm fired. Malcolm closed his eyes, the weight of it all crashing down. They weren't just targeting him anymore. They were going after everyone around him, Linda, Denise, Nia. The bank wasn't just fighting to win. They were fighting to destroy. That evening, the lock on his room had been changed. The manager, a stout man with a permanent scowl, stood by the door, arms crossed. Can't let you back in without payment, he said. Malcolm didn't argue. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked away, his posture heavy with the weight of defeat. Homeless, broke, and now his evidence was useless if he couldn't survive long enough to use it. He spent the night in a 24-hour laundromat, nodding off in a hard plastic chair while the dryers hummed around him. When the sun rose, he made his way to the courthouse, determined to file the new evidence, no matter what. But when he arrived, the same tired-looking clerk from before, Hoff, simply shook her head. Judge Crawley's calendar is full. He won't be hearing any new motions until next month. Next month, Malcolm snapped. By then, they'll have sold the house. She shrugged. Sorry, Mr. Reese. I don't make the rules. Malcolm stumbled out of the courthouse, heart hammering. They had shut every door, cut off every lifeline. For the first time since this fight began, he felt truly defeated. That night, he sat in his car, parked beneath a flickering street lamp, staring at the courthouse in the distance. He had given everything to this fight, his time, his money, his sanity, and the system had chewed him up and spit him out. Was this how it ended? Broken, homeless, forgotten. But as Malcolm sat there, exhausted and hollow, he thought of his mother, of her calloused hands after double shifts at the diner, of the way she'd smiled, tired but proud, when she made the final mortgage payment. She had fought her whole life against a system designed to break her, and she had never given up. Neither would he. With shaking hands, Malcolm opened his laptop, using the free Wi-Fi from the diner across the street. He drafted a motion for an emergency hearing, citing newly uncovered fraud and possible judicial misconduct. He attached Linda's screenshots, Denise's affidavit, and a detailed timeline of every retaliatory move the bank had made. Then he filed it electronically, immediately, with copies sent to every local news outlet he could find. Malcolm didn't sleep that night. He sat in his car, watching the courthouse lights flicker off one by one, waiting for the next blow, because he knew it was coming. And this time he'd be ready. Malcolm woke in the driver's seat of the borrowed car, his body stiff and cold from another night spent parked outside the courthouse. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, an email notification. His heart pounded as he unlocked the screen and read the subject line. Emergency motion hearing scheduled, Friday, 10 a.m. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. Friday was only 2 days away, and the bank wouldn't stay silent. He needed more than evidence now. He needed reinforcements. That afternoon, Malcolm walked into the office of the Justice Collective, a small civil rights group known for taking on cases of systemic injustice. The receptionist, a young black woman with box braids and a skeptical expression, glanced up as he approached. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, eyeing the battered backpack slung over his shoulder. "No," Malcolm admitted, placing Linda's folder and the newly filed motion on the desk. But I have proof of a bank committing fraud, harassing witnesses, and using the courts to steal homes. And if someone doesn't help me, they're going to get away with it." The receptionist hesitated, glancing at the papers. Then, she sighed and picked up the phone. "Wait here." 15 minutes later, Malcolm was sitting across from Taryn Boyd, one of the collective's lead attorneys. Boyd, a tall black man with graying hair and the weary expression of someone who had fought too many uphill battles, flipped through the documents in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was grim. "Damn," Boyd muttered, holding up the email chain between Lambert and Klein. "They didn't even try to hide it. This is textbook foreclosure fraud. And Crawley's involvement." He shook his head. "If this gets out, it'll blow up the whole racket." "So, you'll help?" Malcolm asked, barely daring to hope. Boyd nodded. "We'll file an amicus brief supporting your motion and start prepping for Friday. But listen, Malcolm, this isn't just a foreclosure case anymore. If you push this, you're going to expose an entire network of corruption. The bank, the judge, maybe even people higher up. They've already taken everything," Malcolm said, his jaw tightening. "I've got nothing left to lose." Boyd studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "All right, let's make some noise." The next 48 hours were a blur. Boyd's team worked through the night, drafting motions, reaching out to media outlets, and rallying community organizations. Malcolm barely slept, running on adrenaline and cheap coffee. Every time his phone buzzed, he braced himself for more retaliation. A frozen account, another eviction notice, maybe even an arrest warrant. But nothing came. It was too quiet. The bank was regrouping, planning something. Friday morning, the sky was gray and cold as Malcolm stood outside the courthouse, clutching the worn manila folder that had become his lifeline. Nia arrived first, worry etched across her face, but determination burning in her eyes. "You ready for this?" she asked quietly. "Ready as I'll ever be," Malcolm replied, squeezing her hand. Then, Denise Fowler appeared, glancing nervously over her shoulder as she hurried up the steps. "I'm here," she said breathlessly. "I'll testify, but if they retaliate..." Boyd interrupted, stepping up beside Malcolm. "We've got reporters inside. This hearing's public record." Now, they couldn't sweep it under the rug. Together, they entered the courtroom. It was packed. Reporters, community activists, and curious onlookers filled the gallery. Malcolm spotted Linda Ortiz near the back. She nodded silently in support. At the plaintiff's table, Bryce Lambert sat rigidly, his usual smugness replaced by cold calculation. Judge Crawley, clearly irritated by the media presence, adjusted his robe and banged the gavel. "This is an emergency hearing regarding the foreclosure of 1628 Pine Street," Crawley announced, his voice sharp. "Mr. Reese, you may proceed." Malcolm stood, his heart pounding. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head. "Your Honor," Malcolm began, "this foreclosure is based on fraudulent documents. The second mortgage my mother allegedly signed was notarized without her presence. The notary, Denise Fowler, is here to testify." Crawley's eyes flickered with something. Annoyance, maybe even fear, before he leaned back. "Proceed." Denise stepped forward, hands trembling as she took the oath. Under Boyd's steady questioning, she confirmed everything. She had stamped the document without witnessing the signature, pressured by a bank representative. Lambert shot to his feet. "Objection. This is hearsay and irrelevant to the foreclosure process." Malcolm didn't wait for the judge's response. He stepped forward, holding up the email chain from Linda's folder. "Irrelevant," he repeated. "These emails between Mr. Lambert and Darren Klein prove they knew the documents were forged and pushed the eviction through anyway. They even discussed bypassing standard procedures to avoid scrutiny." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Crawley banged the gavel, his face darkening. "Order." "Mr. Reese," the judge said, voice clipped. "Do you have proof that these emails are authentic?" Boyd rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we subpoenaed the bank's internal servers yesterday. The metadata confirms their authenticity." The court has an obligation to investigate. Lambert's face paled. He leaned toward Crawley, whispering furiously. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment Malcolm feared he would dismiss the motion outright. Evidence be damned. But then, something shifted. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Phones flashed as reporters sent out updates in real time. Crawley's gaze swept the room, and Malcolm saw realization dawn in his eyes. This case was already bigger than the courtroom. It was public, unstoppable. With visible reluctance, Crawley sighed and banged the gavel once more. The court will conduct a full review of the foreclosure process, including the authenticity of the mortgage documents. Until then, the foreclosure is stayed, and Mr. Reese retains possession of the property. Malcolm's knees nearly buckled. He had done it. He had stopped the eviction. But victory felt hollow. As the crowd filtered out, Lambert brushed past Malcolm, his expression ice-cold. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You just made enemies you can't afford." Malcolm didn't flinch. So did you. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing. Boyd fielded questions while Malcolm stood quietly, exhaustion finally washing over him. Nia slipped her hand into his. "You won," she murmured. "At least for now." "Yeah," Malcolm said, his voice rough, "but they're not done. They'll come back harder." And they would. The bank had too much to lose. Crawley had too many secrets to protect. Malcolm had forced them into the light, but cornered animals were the most dangerous. Had he really secured his home? Or had he just triggered a retaliation that could destroy him completely? Comment number 1 if you believe Malcolm should keep fighting, no matter the risk. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe justice is worth the struggle. But here's the real question. With the bank wounded and desperate, what ruthless move will they make next? And can Malcolm survive it? Stay tuned for the next part. Friday morning. The day arrived colder and grayer than usual, the sky hanging low over the courthouse like a warning. Malcolm stood on the steps, gripping his folder of evidence so tightly his knuckles turned white. This hearing wasn't just about his house anymore. It was about survival. His, Denise's, Linda's, and everyone else the bank had steamrolled without consequence. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, cameras flashing despite the bailiff's half-hearted warnings. Darren Klein resigned under pressure. Bryce Lambert was suspended, pending a Bar Association ethics review. Even Judge Crawley found himself under scrutiny, his financial ties to the bank exposed in a separate whistleblower report. But for Malcolm, the real victory came quietly. One evening, as he sat on the porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug his mother had once loved, a middle-aged black woman approached, her teenage son following close behind. "Mr. Reese?" she asked, her voice hesitant but filled with hope. "I just wanted to say thank you. My sister was about to lose her house. Same bank, same forged documents. Because of your case, they dropped the foreclosure. She's keeping her home." Malcolm smiled, warmth spreading through his chest. "That's why we fight," he said simply. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the house that had once seemed lost forever, Malcolm knew the battle wasn't truly over. The system would regroup, adapt, and find new ways to exploit the vulnerable. But now people were watching, questioning, fighting back. And Malcolm Reese, once dismissed as just another victim, was leading the charge. Because power didn't belong to those with money, titles, or connections. It belonged to those who refused to back down. And Malcolm? He was just getting started. Malcolm Reese's fight wasn't just about reclaiming a home. It was about exposing a system designed to exploit the powerless. His story revealed hard truths. Banks don't always play fair. Courts often side with corporations. The system favors those with money and influence. But his fight also proved something even more powerful. Resilience, knowledge, and community can turn the tide, even against overwhelming odds. One of the biggest lessons from Malcolm's case is the importance of knowing your rights. The bank counted on him being uninformed, on the legal jargon confusing him into submission. But Malcolm didn't just accept what he was told. He questioned, researched, and dug deeper until he found the cracks in their case. His determination transformed what seemed like an inevitable loss into a landmark victory. Another crucial takeaway is the power of solidarity. Malcolm didn't win this fight alone. Linda Ortiz, Denise Fowler, the Justice Collective, and even whistleblowers within the bank stood beside him. Corrupt systems thrive when victims feel isolated and powerless. But when people unite, share information, and hold institutions accountable, real change becomes possible. Finally, Malcolm's story is a reminder that justice isn't automatic. It's fought for, step by step, often at great personal cost. The system only changes when ordinary people refuse to back down, even when the odds seem impossible. Now it's your turn. Do you think Malcolm should have accepted the settlement and walked away? Or was he right to keep fighting even at great risk? Comment 1. If you believe standing up against corruption is always worth it, no matter the cost. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the story if you believe more people need to hear about the power of resilience and justice. Thank you for watching. And remember, the fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom. Continues every day, in every community. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never underestimate the power of one determined voice. Take care and see you in the next story.